The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello, and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. My guest today is Daniel Schorr. Daniel Schorr has devoted 56 years of his life to journalism. He's covered stories around the world and covered American politics and political trends from his home base in Washington, D.C. He's worked in print for the Christian Science Monitor, the New York Times, on television for CBS and CNN. He currently works in radio as senior news analyst for National Public Radio, where he's been since 1986. Have you ever wanted to be anything but a reporter?
No, I never wanted to be anything but a reporter. I mean, I never even recall having made a decision to be a reporter. I just was sort of born to it. When I was 12 years old, and living on the ground floor of an apartment house in the Bronx, and heard a big plop outside the window and looked out, and there was somebody dead who had jumped off the roof. And I stood there and waited for the police to come and listen to what they were finding out, and I called a local newspaper and said, "You want a story about a man who committed suicide?" And they paid me $5. 12.
And that was it?
And that was it, you know, very thrilling.
I heard you tell that story to Scott Simon on Weekend Edition some time ago, and the question that popped into my mind when you told that story was, why at the age of 12 did you have that reaction? I mean, other 12-year-olds would have had a totally different reaction to something like that, but what made you react in that way as an observer?
That was, in fact, a question I've often asked myself. When people say, you know, what is the essence of being a reporter? The essence of a reporter is being disengaged, being able to be at events which may be very emotional for those involved, and may be emotional for you when you go home and talk about it. But at the time, you know, you are a professional. You are a doctor performing an operation. You don't think of who the patient is, you're just doing the operation. And I always thought of journalism somehow as this kind of thing where you are detached, you're a person on the wall. Obviously that can't be true anymore, not in this day and age when person in journalism is almost as interesting to people as what he's reporting about, so they're interested in you. But the fact of the matter is, I've always considered journalism to be not just something you work at, but it's an attitude. It's not an attitude that I love very much. I don't admire it, because what it really means is that you're never the one who's working people's political campaigns, even as a young person, and you're never signing petitions, you're never getting involved in things, and I think involvement is a very good thing. But I always have this way of saying my job is staying uninvolved and then describing it to other people.
You never got tired at any point of that role of saying, gee, I feel like I never do things myself, I'm always talking about people who do.
No, that's right. Now, you know, and nowadays I give lectures here and there, and people, crazy people say things like, "Mr. Schorr, you understand the political system so well, why don't you run for office?" And I laugh. I laugh uncontrollably. The idea of my campaigning, of my offering programs and policies and doing all these things is totally laughable to me. I'm on the other side of the fence.
Now, this whole business of being detached, being removed, and being the observer, some reporters might have to learn that, but again, at 12 years old, it was just part of who you were. Why were you that person at 12 years old?
Well, I don't know. I mean, someday you'll lie down on a couch and try to get a psychologist to explain it to me. You know, and then he will tell me, well, your father died when you were 5, and the shock of that was maybe so great that from then on you had to remove yourself from feeling, you know. But I can't tell you what other people should tell me.
That's a question you'll leave for later. You're just too busy right now.
But I don't think I'll find the answer. That's the trouble.
Can you think back to your early notions of when you were just starting out, what you thought it would be like to be a reporter?
Oh, sure, because that was easy. Because in those days, it was a period between the two wars. Born in 1916, so here I was in 1920s and 30s. And all the romantic figures were the great war correspondents of World War I, Vincent Sheehan, Floyd Gibbons, names you're too young to have known. And there were these people in trench coats, and it was mainly newspapers then. It was even sort of before radio. And they went around the world and led a very, very romantic life. They traveled a lot, they ate in the best places, drank in the best places, and were apparently, I assumed, always with the most beautiful women around. And so I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I mean, foreign correspondent was the thing to be. But you had to start small and start in the Bronx. You don't get to be a foreign correspondent right away. But that was the great ideal, the foreign correspondent.
So eventually you became a foreign correspondent. You got your trench coat and your fedora. And what was life really like?
No fedora. I never could wear a hat very well. Trench coat was fine, but fedora bit had to go. Well, life was like everything else. The romantic notions of what a profession is quickly fade when you're faced with the realities, practicality of having to deal with it. And so a lot of it was having to perform assignments that people wanted me to do, which I thought were not the assignments I wanted to do. Never getting enough space for what I thought was the biggest story in the world. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. And finding that where I was frequently was not considered to be the front page story of the day, even though I thought so. And so it was constantly sort of fitting into large institutions and their requirements, which I was never too very good at. But on the other hand, I'm giving too much to the negative side to this, but in fact the matter was, it really was very thrilling. It really was wonderful to see how other people live and to learn their languages and to experience the culture of the Netherlands, where I lived for a long time. I may be one of 5 Americans who can speak Dutch, for example, right? I don't know who the other 4 are, and I have long memories, and I can go back today to Holland, to Amsterdam, to Hague, or go back to Germany and places like that, and it expands your existence to find that you're partaking in the existence of other cultures and other peoples, and we haven't even gotten to the Soviet Union.
Can you remember a time in those days when you were working as a foreign correspondent? You had the little bits of disillusionment about what hard work of any type is really like, but where you had a story and you had a moment where you said to yourself, this is it. You know, I've done the right thing. This is exactly where I want to be.
Oh, I guess, I'm not sure whether it's because I did the right thing or because it was a terribly wonderful stroke of luck. But in 1957, stationed in Moscow for CBS, and we've been trying, everybody had been trying for a long time to try to get an interview with Nikita Khrushchev, who had never appeared on television at all. And so we did these things about writing letters all the time and saying we think he should appear and all. And one day, after several routine letters of that sort, Foreign Ministry press office called up and said, are you still interested in interviewing Nikita Khrushchev? And so we went into a lot of negotiations, and executives came, they were over, and next thing we knew, we did 1 hour, Nikita Khrushchev in his office, in the Kremlin, which nobody had ever been in before, for 1 hour on Face the Nation on CBS. And it was a great and thrilling moment for me, mind you.
One of the reasons that moment took place was that a few years before, in 1953, was it? Edward R. Morrow issued an invitation to you.
Yes, up until 53, I was basically print. New York Times, before then Christian Science Monitor, and I thought of myself as print. However, when every once in a while, CBS would call and ask, could I do a little spot for them on this or that story. So slowly I began to do a little radio on the side. February 1st, 1953, the dikes of South Holland broke in a terrible storm. The tide was wrong, and there was an awful storm in the North Sea. It did something that had not happened in 200 years. The dikes broke, and large parts of Netherlands, which, as you know, are underwater, under sea level, behind dikes, flooded. And very big story, obviously. Funny that today I say not great tragedy, big story, right? Isn't that the way we talk? Mm-hmm. They asked me to do some broadcasts, and I did long broadcasts, and because I spoke Dutch, and U.S. Army helicopters came in, and I could go out in the helicopters and interview people in trees. It was really terribly dramatic, and made great radio. And one day, shortly thereafter, there came this cable, which I shall never forget, from Ed Murrow. The cadence of the cable was the way Murrow talks. It was, "Would you at all consider joining the staff of CBS News with an initial assignment in Washington?"
You'd assume you'd leap in the air and say, yes, 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 but you were ambivalent about that.
Yeah, you really have read the record. Yes, I was ambivalent because I didn't take radio quite seriously. Oh, Murrow was a great and wonderful name, but I was living in Europe and wasn't even very aware of the role that Murrow was playing at the time. And in '53, he was not as famous as he subsequently became. This was sort of before McCarthy. So he was the famous guy from the war, now doing something in New York, God knows what. And I was always wanted to be a New York Times foreign correspondent forever and ever and ever. And radio was showbiz, it was entertainment, and it was nice to do things for them, a little extra money and so on. But yeah, I wasn't sure, but I took the leap anyway.
And what's been the impact of making that decision?
Well, oddly enough, the impact of making that decision was to launch me on a 25-year career with CBS. Also, many, all full of excitement, the Watergate and the CIA investigations. Watching the beginning of the wall in Berlin in 1961, doing a documentary in East Germany after the wall went up. Full of great events, which now form a wonderful sort of part will form a great part of my memoirs if I can take time to write them. And all of that. But oddly enough, during all of that time, decreasingly, but during all of that time, every once in a while I would ask myself, is this really what I want to be doing? And there was a period of which, when I went to Washington, a friend of mine was James Scotty Reston of the New York Times. And once every 2 or 3 months, he would say to me, "Had enough?" And I would say, "Scotty, almost. Not yet, quite. Maybe another couple of months." And we had this joke, which by this time we knew was a joke, that it was just fooling around for a few months or a year, and that eventually I would go back and do what every good person does when he dies, that is, goes and works for the New York Times. And, but no, it didn't happen. I was ambivalent. I remain ambivalent. You see, I sit here and talk to you, and I kind of like this atmosphere. There's the camera, and you asking good and interesting questions and all, and I like the studio, and I can do it. I don't freeze up, never did freeze up, and all the rest of it, and so on. And yes, yeah, but it's not like picking up the paper tomorrow morning and seeing your byline and seeing something which you have actually spent a lot of time, word for word, working out exactly right. It has a permanence that these electronic images can never have for me. And every now and then, I've got to stop what I'm doing and do an op-ed page piece for a newspaper and so on, because I cannot lose that connection with print. That's, for me, the ultimate reality in journalism.
So much was achieved, though, in those years at CBS, and the names of the people who were working at CBS at that time, led by Murrow and Fred Friendly, you, Eric Sevareid, a group of journalists probably never again be assembled, that character and that quality.
Well, never again be assembled that way, because television today will not need and does not want that collection of people. It was funny, the names you mentioned, I most recently heard reeled off by Mike Wallace when he did a little, paid his respects on 60 Minutes to the late William S. Paley. And he spoke of Paley as having put together this great news team of Murrow, and Cronkite, and Sevareid, and Richard C. Hotelet, and David Schoenbrunn, Alexander Kendrick, and Schorr, Dan Schorr, and so on. I heard those names all together and then remembered how it was like when we all worked together. But when we used to work together, we'd all be foreign correspondents, and then we'd be brought back at the end of each year, and Mr. Paley would have a luncheon for us because we were his big foreign correspondents. And then we would do a program called Years of Crisis every year. We'd sit around, and for an hour, I think once for an hour and a half, we would talk about what had happened in the world and what it meant. In those days, you could get an hour or an hour of nothing but talk among CBS journalists, because we were aristocrats and we were treated that way. Well, now the ratings may not have been so good, but whatever, today television will not support a bunch of talking heads that way, will not keep the bureaus open. The CBS bureau in Bonn is closed, CBS bureau in Paris is closed, ABC is closing bureaus, and the kind of people who man those bureaus are not needed or desired any longer by television. So we can get the pictures, we'll put on the pictures here.
When did TV start to change?
Well, TV always was in a state of tension with pure journalism because TV is basically not a medium of information, it's a medium of entertainment. And so if you push entertainment onto television, you can't do too much of it, and if you do it, you have to play by television's rules, which is a little bit Hollywood's rules. But when you had your great giants like Paley and David Sarnoff at NBC, RCA, and Goldenson at ABC, they had come in and they had certain respect for this. And so even if it didn't make money, they would provide time and devote resources to news because it was nice. I think it was also because they didn't know what it meant in the communications law, saying that they had to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. They thought maybe if they didn't do some serious things, they might lose their licenses in the days when no one knew what would happen. But beyond all that, they were willing to do unprofitable things. And news before the age of 60 Minutes was never profitable. And therefore, it had to be something which was institutionally done because you wanted to do it. All three networks now have changed hands. All of them are looking at bottom line, and all of them are saying news has to pay for itself or out or cut down or whatever. And when you've got bookkeepers deciding what your values are, then it just is all gone, and that's where we are today.
But is CNN an exception to that? I mean, here's a television network that does nothing but news all the time.
Yes, but CNN is a big exception. That's the great vision of Ted Turner. And in part, what has made CNN so successful is that people want more news today than they will get today on commercial networks. He kind of foresaw that. He said, well, look, I can do it more cheaply than they do. And it's true. It's a much more stripped down kind of operation. There aren't $1 million stars, $5 million stars, nor with the lavish hand. And he found that he did what a lot of people thought he couldn't do, was put on 24 hours a day of news. A lot of it repeats itself, but still fairly cheaply. And since he saw that doing it in the age of satellite and cable, that you didn't have to compete for ratings with 3 other stations or 2 other stations, that you could start with a small audience where you didn't need to have that mass audience and just slowly give a small audience on cable this additional option, that by starting with a modest goal, he made it work. And now I think it's certainly exceeded his dream, certainly mine.
There were a lot of naysayers about CNN when it started out, and you worked there for some years. Does it give you optimism that this all-news channel is such a success with viewers?
Well, the only optimism it gives me is that if it weren't there and things were happening as they're happening in commercial television, things would be desperate. And the fact that there is this option, it really represents in a way the same kind of option that public television also represents with McNeil era and occasional documentaries, Frontline. The same thing that NPR represents. It is the last alternative for people desperate to be informed. And the fact that it works and those people, it still doesn't have what you would call a mass audience in this country. It still is more influential because of what it is than because of the numbers of people who watch at any given time. But it also is extending a global reach as well. And so it doesn't console me for way in which true information is dying on the commercial networks, but it is wonderful that there is something else there.
You said if Edward R. Murrow were alive today, he'd work for NPR, like you do.
I didn't say that. Fred Friendly said that. And I was delighted to have him say that, and delighted to repeat it. Friendly, who really knew Murrow much better than I did and worked very closely with him, said that, and it was quoted as saying that, and that quote is now up at the wall at NPR. It's a great inspiration to NPR to think that might possibly be, and I think it is conceivably true. I could not see Murrow in today's CBS, for example. And if he was going to be in this field, I could conceive of his, assuming he'd be willing to work for some small fraction of what he used to make, doing things at NPR, sure.
There are times that you've become news,
Right.
not through any choice of your own, I guess, except that you have made decisions that have ended up
Right.
putting you into the news, to turn up on the Nixon enemies list, left the Moscow bureau over a fight about your ability to do your job as you did at CNN.
Well, the Russians kicked me out of Moscow. That was easy. The Russians decided they had enough of me, and they...
The greatest fight, though, came when you arranged for the publication of a classified House report on the CIA.
It wasn't classified. House reports are not classified.
They want to be
Congressional
classified.
reports are not classified. We have to be very exact, even after all these years. The administration claimed that information in that report had been derived from classified sources. But a congressional report is not classified because only the executive branch can classify.
So it's like a son of a classified report. If I read your resume, looked through it, and said, "Gee, forced out of Moscow and disagreement here," I'd say, "Gee, this guy might be considered a troublemaker. He could be a problem." Did you see that as part of your job as a journalist, to be a thorn in the side from time to time?
No, because the thorn in the side of is advocacy journalism, which I do not practice. It is not my purpose to be a thorn in the side. However, I do think that it is very important, and it is a principle of the kind of journalism I practice, not so much lately because I'm now a quiet commentator, but when I was reporting, I think it's very important to emphasize finding out what people don't want to tell you, because those are the things that the public needs on the whole to know. If you do the journalism of press conferences and staged events and White House briefings and State Department briefings all the time, it's all right, you've got to do those things. But somewhere you have a sense that this isn't telling us what's really going on. Now, basically, a lot of government officials don't like having what's going on known at certain times. So you are inherently in conflict with these people, and sometimes if you tell what's going on, it creates an enormous stir. I mean, for example, there was a time when I was assigned to sort of cover investigations by Congress of what the CIA had done in the past, and I learned, first one to learn, that the CIA had been involved in assassination conspiracies, Castro and others. And I reported that on the CBS Evening News, and Washington went up in smoke. And the next thing you knew was that a Senate committee had been named to investigate whether or not there had been assassination conspiracies. And a lot of people in the administration were pretty upset about that. Well, it was not my purpose to upset the administration. It really is not my purpose to upset the administration, although I can predict that some things may. My purpose was, how can they keep secret what the CIA was doing in the 50s and 60s? How long do they think that's going to go on? And do they think they can really cover that up forever? So I got to find out a little bit about it and tell people what's going on. So the upsetness and the anger and all the enemies list and so on may become a byproduct of what I do. And I take it in a sense as a compliment. I think that being on Nixon's enemies list was probably bigger for me than being on the Emmy list. But it is not consciously my purpose to stir up trouble.
How do you, now as an analyst, you talked about how you don't believe in advocacy journalism. What is that a fine line between analysis and advocacy?
Well, people find it to be a fine line. People are always saying, well, your opinion, your commentary, and so on and so forth. And let's call it analysis. I don't find the line hard to draw, although some people will not accept the line I draw. One way of putting it is this way. If I tell you how I would like things to be, that's an editorial or it's advocating something. If I tell you this is how I think things are, then it's analysis. Now, some people, if I say, President Bush is doing this and he's contradicting what he said he would do, and so registers with them as an attack on Bush. It is not my purpose to attack Bush or to write an editorial. My purpose is to tell about how I think things are. Some people would question whether that's what I'm really doing. Now, there are people who say, yeah, that's what you say, but unconsciously you seem to be more anti this and more pro that. Well, those perceptions of others, which I will listen to, don't always, I know what my purpose is. My purpose is not that I want to change things, not that I want to denounce things or praise things and so on. I want to get to the essence of how I think things are and try to express that.
The kind of philosophy that you have as a journalist, do you think it's shared by a younger generation of reporters? No.
First of all, I weep for the younger generation of reporters in general, growing up in the age of television, radio and now, but now especially television. I weep for the fact that when you go to communication schools today and say, what are you studying? Public relations. In an older time, public relations was something that an old broken down person would do for his last few years to make a little money when he didn't have it anymore as a reporter. Now you start young and you want to start with verbal prostitution, going into public relations. Or I want to go into television. What do you want to do in television? Oh, production work, I want to swing the camera around, I want all the rest of it, I want to edit tape, I want to do all those things. And there are a myriad number of things, all very obviously important in television, which are what I call journalism. And this generation that's, or I want to investigate something like Woodward and Bernstein. And I want to accept that they were not willing to do what Woodward and Bernstein did, which was spent many, many weeks of patient research to try to get this story. They want to, and sometimes they will confuse innuendo with exposure of something. They hear a rumor and so on and so forth, and they get on the air and say, there's reports tonight, that, and all the rest of it, and they stir up trouble, but they haven't gotten the story, they've gotten a rumor.
One last question. What are we losing because this philosophy of journalism is going away? It's being lost.
Well, I think that part of the mess that this country is in, having trouble finding its bearings, having trouble knowing what is real or what is not real, having this difficulty distinguishing the identity of the people they elected and who are supposed to govern them, getting mad at all of them, but then not knowing what to do instead of those that they have, is all connected with the fact that we have lost in journalism enough influence, because we are under attack now also, and therefore our credibility is also involved. The relationship that used to exist between the press of this country, widely considered, and the people of this country, that they looked to us to tell them what was going on, and now, first of all, not doing it very well, and secondly, when we do it, they get mad at us some of the times. I think that is a tragedy for this country.
And on that note, a topic we could spend much longer talking about. I want to thank you, Daniel Schorr.
Pleasure.
Daniel Schorr, Senior News Analyst for National Public Radio.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.